Thanks everyone for tuning in to our weekly Science Talk webinar series. Today we are joined by the UWIN Stakeholder Engagement team, including Drs. Michael Sukop and Jessica Bolson from Florida International University. As you know, we're recording these and I will post them to our UWIN website and the YouTube channel. So feel free to use the chat queue or turn on your mic and webcam to ask some questions at the end of today's presentations. So with that, I'm excited to introduce both of our presenters for today. Dr. Michael Sukop is a professor at Florida International University, where he has taught and conducted research since 2003. He is a fellow of the Geological Society of America, a licensed professional geologist, and a certified hydrogeologist. He earned his PhD in soil science. Professor Sukop was the lead principal investigator of the National Science Foundation and National Institute of Food and Agriculture supported South Florida Water, Sustainability, and Climate Project. He is the Director of Engagement for the National Science Foundation Sustainability Research Network's program, the Urban Water Innovation Project, which is addressing urban water challenges throughout the United States. Professor Sukop is an executive board member of the Florida Climate Institute Consortium of Florida universities and serves as its liaison to the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which is the organization of 4 counties leading sea level and climate adaptation efforts in South Florida. We are also joined by Dr. Jessica Bolson, Assistant Professor of Earth and Environment at FIU. Dr. Bolson's research primarily focuses on the intersection of environmental governance and climate science, with particular emphasis on water resource decision-making under uncertain climate conditions. She's especially interested in the co-production of scientific information and policy within the hydroclimate context, including the roles of integrated models, stakeholder-scientist interactions, and climate information used in decision-making. Her work investigates topics including the use of climate information to foster adaptation in the management of water resources, individual and group decision-making in areas of natural resource management, and participation in environmental decision-making. In addition to Jessica's research, she has recently taught courses in interdisciplinary climate studies, regional water resource management, and U.S. environmental policy. And with that, I know we can see your lovely faces and your slides, so I'm going to turn it over to you both to kick us off.
All right, thank you. So I'll be giving more or less the first half, and then Jessica will pick up with the kind of more recent things in the second half. This was an interesting experience. You know, we've been working at this for about 6 years, so it's been interesting to go back and look over everything again. And so as an overview of the talk, I'm going to speak briefly about our graduate student and postdoc training component, which this group had responsibility for in the earliest part of the project. And then we'll look at network growth and assessment, including who's been publishing together. This is something that we had as part of a undergraduate student work over a couple of years, actually. And it's been helpful for just looking at how the project has grown and met its objectives, engaging more people. And then we'll get into the stakeholder engagement proper and talk about its evolution. You know, it's been an interesting and complicated path, but you know, from looking at it now in retrospect and where we've come, it kind of looks like it all held together pretty well, and we got to a good place with it all. So that's kind of the take-home message today. Okay, so you know, we're going back to 2014 Sustainability Research Network's program solicitation. And I'll have a couple of quotes from that, and because it really set the tone for what we were trying to achieve and what our objectives should be. So this was about a strong program of linked education and outreach activities that supported the goals of the project and training researchers to meet interdisciplinary research needs in the future, and a range of research and education training opportunities. So what we did is worked with the graduate students and postdocs on the project, and we got them together, and we actually, I thought it was a kind of a cool model that we had in the first couple of years. That we were having stakeholder meetings in these different regions that were part of UWIN. So we combined training in those regions on the day prior to the stakeholder meeting, and that helped that be a bit more effective. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So in 2016, we were talking mostly about adaptive management, some brainstorming techniques that people really like and seem to be pretty powerful. we're looking at Kanban workflow procedures and also techniques for sustaining project momentum, and sort of a retrospective to allow us to learn from our successes and failures basically as we went along. And this was something we tried to stick to through much of the project in terms of conducting retrospectives. So in 2017, we did the same thing. We went around to all the regions. I guess it was 4, maybe in 2017 we went to one more, New York, but I don't know that it had one of these training components. These were focused on listening, leadership, collaborative tools. And then we had Shirley and Deanna Pennington and Dave Gosselin's Embers program, which is another NSF project that we sort of teamed with. And they came and talked about model-based reasoning and socio-environmental synthesis. So in 2018, we weren't going around to all the cities anymore, but we had an annual project meeting. Shirley Vincent led a student workshop on mechanisms to enhance this experience and communication among the students in the project. And then in 2019, we had Deanna Pennington herself come from Embers and kind of facilitate students learning about each other's research and trying to understand the types of projects that were going on in UWIN. And then, of course, came COVID, which decidedly changed everything, and we haven't met in person for a while. Okay. We've done quite a bit of evaluation work, and I just picked one here. This was a few years later. Some people who were in the 2016 cohort, most of them were still reporting that influenced their thinking somewhat, very much, and people had continued to use the skills and techniques, especially the brainstorming, as I mentioned. We also, and I thought this was a great plan, since we were traveling around with a core team, Mazdak, Jerry Pivo, Jessica and I, and in the beginning, Alicia Lanier, we would spend the second half of the training day meeting with the local research team. And this was helping us to kind of build connections with them and understand their regions better, because we were coming in kind of cold sometimes. We were trying to do read aheads, but it really helped us to talk with people in the local regions for a few hours prior to meeting with their stakeholders. This was a good thing. It helped with team building. And then, so regarding the network assessment metrics, we looked at linkages between researchers and stakeholders within the network and how it expanded over the years. We've been looking at the translation of research into practice, papers published, presentations, and then new spin-off funding. And I think a lot of these things are the things that Sarah is following as part of annual and final reporting. But I'm going to focus on the ones that are bold here a little bit more. So, just looking at the photos of what we were doing, you get a pretty good sense of the growth that was going on. It was pretty small in 2015, and then it grew substantially in 2016 and through the subsequent years up to 2019 here. Hey, there's Harry right there. Maybe other people are in here too that are on. And then so we did some quantitative work. You may remember TK. He's now at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but he was an undergraduate student who started producing these network diagrams of the projects. And so we're looking at this expansion over time. Obviously some of us knew each other before we started the proposal, but then those linkages grew as we moved on, and some people became very well connected. There was a lot more higher degree of connection. And that was picked up later by Allison Serlanak at the University of Florida. And so we were also looking at, who's on the project. This was before the proposal too. We had a good, solid grouping of engineers and quite a few geoscientists and so forth. And then remember, the project actually grew out of these what are called water sustainability and climate projects at NSF. And if you look back at the pre-proposal, this is exactly how it went. These folks were leaders of those WSC projects. And so that's how the project started. And so we were major nodes here, but then this changed substantially as we went through the project. And Sharon Harland had a couple of natural and human systems project that we also brought into this group, and as it grew, things changed a lot. You know, the complexion of the types of people involved. Still a lot of engineers, but obviously a lot denser network here. And then if you look, different people, Sarah, obviously a key player in this whole thing, keeping us all going. And so some of the names have changed. You can see some of the stakeholders too. There's Jeff, for example. Okay, and this is kind of remarkable too. So just going over the whole project up to 2019 anyway, you know, we had a huge increase in the number of linkages between people, about a 300% increase. It's pretty substantial and impressive, really, how this went in the project. And we also looked at who was publishing together, and this was a big part of the the effort of the National Science Foundation project, of course, to get journal articles. And so at this point, we looked at this. There were 144 papers, and you know, the connections were pretty good across most of the groups. It would have been nice to kind of integrate even more. There's obviously still some, you know, isolation of large islands, let's say, but by and large, these are pretty good in terms of the number of people that are connected through these publication networks. I felt it's pretty satisfying. Okay, and then another dictate from NSF is that we should be designed to adapt and grow as new opportunities arise, and should be sustainable after the period of NSF funding has ended. So this is something where, you know, we had a lot of spin-off proposals, certainly greater than 30, and Sarah probably will ask for this to be updated again, but I think they go up to 2020, what's in here now. And in fact, this is one of the projects we're working on with Jeff and Harry right now, right? So there was quite a long list here, and it's been successful in that regard. A lot of people got to know each other, understand their research, and were able to combine in new ways to do successful proposals. Okay, so now getting into kind of the meat of the stakeholder stuff. You know, one of the goals of the whole Sustainable Research Networks project is to bring together multidisciplinary teams of researchers, educators, managers, policymakers, and other stakeholders to conduct this collaborative research that addresses fundamental challenges in sustainability. So it's supposed to integrate disciplines, sectors, and backgrounds to create new perspectives and yield new understanding and knowledge, and then link scientists, engineers, and educators, and be geographically dispersed. So, you know, I think we have demonstrated we did pretty well at most of those things. Promoting collaboration with resource managers, policymakers, end users, and other stakeholders in the private and public sectors through direct involvement from the outset of participants from federal, state, and local agencies. So this is what we set out to do in our very first round of meetings, and it looked like this. So we got a lot of public sector representatives, which is appropriate because they're the ones running the water utilities in a lot of places, and a fair number of academics, a good number of nonprofits, and a smaller number of private sector people. So, you know, we had a great turnout. I don't know, like probably, I'm guessing a minimum of 30 at any of our initial meetings. And so I think people came, you know, because we had already established relationships with them in most of these regions through those water sustainability and climate projects, and just other relationships that people have with, you know, people in their own region. And then there were probably also quite a bit of curiosity that drove people to see us. And so we were planning to expand this like threefold by having each participant propose 3 other people. But, you know, we collected the names, but that growth never really happened. In fact, what we saw was a bit of a contraction of the stakeholder groups attending the meetings in the second year. And so we kind of wrestled with this for a while and wondered what to do and if we were getting the right people. And we kind of decided on the small is beautiful, and we were getting the appropriate and adequate information for trying to do what we were doing with the urban water management roadmap. So, you know, this was sort of a decision, but I think I'll talk about this a little bit more too, because, you know, different people in the project wanted to see a lot more diversity in the types of stakeholders we were involving, but in terms of trying to accomplish what we were, it made sense to have water utilities being primarily represented. Okay. So here's what some of these meetings look like. I guess this one's Colorado, right? We did brainstorming to try to figure out what the different problems different utilities were facing were, what the strengths and threats and successes, what kind of impediments to solving their problems, and then what kind of needs stakeholders had for their research, and then doing this network expansion activity that I mentioned. We did pre and post workshop surveys, analyzed the data, and these are broadly considered quite successful that first year. We were able to collect quite a bit of information. Harry, again, you're a star. So in year 2, we went around and we were kind of in a transition period. We were trying different models as we were experiencing what was happening, meeting with people, and trying to make sure that we were keeping them engaged to the extent possible and keeping it valuable to the stakeholders. So we were looking at problems and issues and governance, metrics and different kinds of solutions. Actionable science was a big topic, and then barriers were really focused for a while. And then also pathways. What kind of pathways can we have to transition towards more integrated management of urban water systems? And then we threw in at some places segments on funding and financing of utilities, which was identified as a pretty big issue in many places. So from that, follow-up years 1 and 2, we had a publication in Water Resources Research, and Jessica led this thing. And so we were, setting the context for national scale case studies of stakeholder-scientist interactions across the 5 regions. And, climate change impacts, water quality impairment, and aging infrastructure were kind of the greatest challenges for sustainability. And then innovative solutions, addressing limited public awareness, support for water management, communication with decision makers are really the most desired across all the sites. So the things we learned. Now we also, learned some difficult messages in some instances. I mean, we had the challenge of aligning the research to the immediate needs of our stakeholders. And you can imagine when you sit down to write an NSF proposal, you have to identify who's going to be on it. And so a lot of times their research is pretty well defined already, and perhaps doesn't have much latitude for really adjusting to the needs of particular stakeholders or things that are learned from stakeholders as you move forward. So this was one of the big challenges. So that made it difficult to cater to their immediate specific needs. And on top of that, we were planning to meet once a year for, I guess, 5 years, but then we really only did 2 years, and contact became kind of infrequent. And that I'll take a lot of personal responsibility for that. We didn't follow up as times as we probably should have. And then, we were starting to recognize, at least in the earliest days, that there was quite a bit of a gulf between what the researchers were working on and what the water managers really needed and what their primary concerns were. I think that over time, this has improved too, and we've really been able to kind of move our research a bit more to be more practical, frankly, and address the questions that we've identified over the years. I think it's been very successful in that regard, getting around some of these things. Other things we ran into that, we're especially getting criticism internally, perhaps, from some of our people who would have preferred us to reach out to more broader stakeholder group. It kind of doesn't matter what your stakeholder perception is, who they should be. And Sharon, I see you're here now, so I'm thinking about you in particular, and Liz Mack. We found that everybody was in our stakeholder groups generally were from similar socioeconomic and kind of technocratic backgrounds. That sort of led to a bit of a group think where we were all thinking along the same lines. Not optimal, perhaps. And I got in trouble here. If you read this over here, sometimes we're doing gentle ribbing, or what we think of as gentle ribbing, but it can be taken as a personal affront. And so if we're making this kind of humor about people being short-termers or something, or profiteers. We're talking about developers and lawyers. This woman was a lawyer for developers in particular, but she basically quit because it was too far of a too big of a gap to bridge. So we had trouble getting siege representatives, social equity and environmental justice representatives to actually come sometimes. So we had a handful of successes, but they weren't really prolonged. And so we didn't end up really doing that much effort to get regular citizens or disadvantaged people. And part of this we kind of attributed to, everybody being in their comfort zones. And that worked both ways for us and presumably for the people that we sometimes tried to engage but weren't so successful. So then, the question was, do we have the right stakeholders for the urban water management emphasis? And this goes back to what I was saying before. Our stakeholders didn't get as much feedback from the project as they probably should have. And what Jessica and I were thinking about as we were doing this kind of summation here, we feel like we're in a place now where the stakeholders we continue to engage locally and regionally here, they don't really associate us with UWIN, but they think of us and we're the ones who work with them. So this has been sort of how the whole thing has evolved in our perspective. So over the following years, there was an evolution of the stakeholder engagement. We explored some other modes of interaction in Denver, New York City, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and a few others. And there was also, this seminar series itself was kind of intended to be kind of a culmination of this that could allow stakeholders to have additional input at this point and kind of see where we've come over the duration of the project. And I just wanted to touch on this. In the beginning, there was a vision that we'd be a centralized, stakeholder-driven, stakeholder member kind of funded entity, much like WRF is. But I think that as time has gone on, it's become clear that we have become instead, at least at the moment, more of a decentralized, stakeholder-driven entity that kind of leverages funding from various research sources to help our stakeholders. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who is going to talk about the more recent developments and kind of where we evolved to.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'll just say next for next slide, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Mike. So first I want to kind of just bring attention to the amazing amount of engagement that's been going on regionally. And some of these efforts are mapped out in this image. And, while we can't attribute these completely to UWIN, the ideas that are generated in these regional efforts certainly feed back into our network and vice versa. So for example, as part of the project that's in Miami, the Resilient 305 project, which Mike and I work on, I often find myself, discussing a lot of the stuff that I've learned about and that we work on in UWIN with the stakeholders that we're working with in Miami. And, extending this further, the people that we're working with in each of these regions have become a part of the work and the ideas that are generated through our network. And so they really are an extension of the UWIN network. And I think, how we sort of capture and measure this type of growth is a question that we might want to think about. So for those of you who don't do this work and aren't that, connected to the regional stakeholder engagement efforts that a lot of our colleagues are working in, I just wanted to describe some examples. So again, in Miami, we have this Resilient 305 effort, which is a largely diverse stakeholder driven effort where Mike and I have been working on for the past couple of years. And basically we've been developing metrics for resilience. And this is sort of similar to what we're doing with the WRF project, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes here. But basically, these efforts are expected to lead to some kind of assessment tool where Miami can self-assess progress towards resilience across a broad range of criteria. You know, a lot of, again, sorry about my dog barking, a lot of there's a lot of cross-fertilization. So again, you know, I often find myself talking about extreme heat and green infrastructure. And just at the last meeting, you know, somebody was asking about, wouldn't it be great if there was a roving robot that would go through our city and talk to people about heat in neighborhoods? And I was like, hey, we have an idea. Like, so there's a lot of this sort of cross-fertilization. There's other efforts obviously going on that are amazing examples of stakeholder science collaborations. So for example, in New York City, the New York City Stormwater Resilience Project, which MASDAC and Jennifer Terrier and others have worked on, is a really good example of a academic public partnership. The work going on in Denver with the National Water Center and the Denver One Water Plan are all sort of efforts that are really good sort of models of this sort of stakeholder science engagement. And one of our researchers, Dave Handula, even became a stakeholder himself. So if you didn't know, he's, I think, still at ASU, but he's now the director of the Office of Heat Response for the city of Phoenix. And, you know, through conversations, I remember him talking about how he always wanted to bring his work back to the community. And so obviously he's doing this, and this is part of our network. So, you know, all of this is to say that our network has really become rooted even more deeply in these communities. And I think it's important to sort of just reflect back on that and think about what it means for projects like ours. It might not fit in this sort of original image of what we thought of when we think of UWIN, but, you know, capturing that and all that value is really important. I also want to say this is obviously like nowhere near a comprehensive list. It was just meant to be a sample of some of the stuff that's going on. Okay, next. So as Mike mentioned in the slide about, you know, extended or other offshoot projects, one of the projects we've been working on is a WRF project with some of our colleagues that are in this meeting right now. It was the One Water Cities Development of Guidance Documents and Assessment Metrics project. And we've been working on this with MASDAC and Sarah and Inga Wersma and Jacqueline Reed from Kroll Engineers and Christy Wamstop from the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. And then also students who are doing amazing work like Danya and Galen from CSU. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this project and sort of describe how it ties back into UWIN efforts, and specifically how I think this sort of product of this project ties into the original goal of UWIN to build this blueprint for One Water. And so, you know, I just want to sort of put that original image of stakeholder engagement back out there. So we sort of originally thought we would engage with stakeholders from across the country, you know, collect input, sort of develop this framework, this tool, and then bring it back out. And obviously things have shifted because of COVID and different sort of, you know, sort of occurrences in the project. But the product of this WRF project, which is this framework for assessment, sort of reflects a lot of what we thought of that original tool would be. Next. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in a little more detail about this WRF project now. So the objective of this project was to develop a system so that cities could sort of self-assess their progress towards One Water. And to develop this, we used key informant interviews with a lot of the stakeholders that we knew through UWIN. We conducted a national scale online survey of water management professionals. We did a comprehensive lit review, which was largely driven by some of our amazing students. And we are going to participate and facilitate a workshop, which is in the first week of June. So this one's coming up. Next. And so I'm going to share some of the results from the interview and survey with you, and then we'll share this sort of draft rating system with you too. So first, the interviews. So the interviews were conducted by Inga, Sarah, and myself by Zoom. And I just want to say, Sarah, it was so nice to have Sarah sort of step out of the purely administrative role and get back into her research and anthropology roots. She was super helpful. It was really nice to work with Sarah in this light. So we sort of shared the lift of these interviews. We conducted 17 interviews with 17 different water utilities across the country. And we spoke with 28 people. So on some of the calls, there were like 2 or 3 participants. We had a diverse sample, so we covered some large and some small scale utilities. So, LA, New York, San Francisco, and on the big side, and then on the smaller side, Vancouver, Washington, Fort Collins, and Ashburn, Virginia. And we did this intentionally because we thought that this would give us a really good idea of sort of the range of factors driving this transition to One Water. Okay. Next. So the purpose of our interviews was to identify key elements and gather information that could be used to measure this progress towards One Water. And so how the interviews sort of went, we started with a definition of One Water so that we would all kind of be on the same page. And then we asked about, the interviewees' vision of what would their agency look like in this One Water future. So it was really broad. And then we went to more specific questions on, data and metrics, drivers, leadership, collaboration, finance, these types of things. And then we revisited the definition and we asked for feedback on this definition. And these interviews were amazing. They were super interesting. And it was so amazing that in an hour, you got a really good feel, an hour by Zoom, you would get a really good feel of just how different the operational and organizational cultures are at these different agencies. And so, I know it goes without saying, but it just really reinforced this realization of just how much our stakeholders, how much knowledge they have to share with us and how much we learned from them. Okay, next. So, as an example, we heard a lot about the importance of this One Water mindset and having this this really open and sort of adaptive organizational culture. And I just pulled a few quotes. We have a lot of amazing quotes, but I pulled a few that really spoke to these themes. So collaboration and leadership and the need to really, push ahead to change and transition things from status quo. So this first quote was from our Honolulu interview, and they're working on an ordinance basically that would formalize and institutionalize collaboration. So it would require collaboration across administrations. And this is really, an impressive thing from a policy perspective to put these things into a formal method like this. The second was, from Philadelphia. And so you can think of how do you bring energy, job creation, flood mitigation, climate resilience, into one project. And so it really sort of captured this idea of how difficult it is for these professionals to be trying to consider all this stuff in a project basis. And then finally, the last two, again, speak to how important it is to have this One Water mindset again, and then what this collaborative spirit means, and that integrative doesn't always mean collaborative. And so we heard about these things across agencies. So regardless of size, regardless of region, these were the things that we kept hearing. And so, we unpacked this idea of what does this mean? What is this mindset that we're talking about a little bit more? And we had a lot of conversations about it. So it's been really, really interesting. Okay, next slide. And then, so we had a lot of data from these 17 interviews. So Danya did the heavy lifting of transcribing these interviews and coding them using in vivo. And we code these to sort of capture the different themes that come out in the data. And so, for example, when the stakeholders, participants mention these terms on the right column, they get coded as these interview themes, okay? And then from these themes, we developed key elements. Next slide. And here are the key elements that we came up with. So again, I'm not going to read through all of these. These are the sort of the ones that we know about, right? I'll give you a couple seconds to kind of read through them. Okay, so from these key elements, right, we then divided them up among our research team, and we sort of asked each researcher to look back at the transcriptions and look back through the lit review, and to try to identify 5 to 7 indicators for each of these key elements. Okay, so now we have this set of key elements and a set of indicators for each element, and then we vetted them among the team. Okay, next slide. And then we use these to inform the development of our survey. Okay, so I said before we had this national scale survey, and the purpose of that survey was to collect information on these key elements. So, you know, we asked questions like, you know, did we miss anything? Are these key elements reflective of what you're thinking? How important are they? How likely are you to implement progress towards these key elements? These types of questions. And there were 20 questions, but in hindsight, it was, you know, probably way too complicated because each question had like multiple sub questions. So it was 100 questions disguised as 20 maybe. But, you know, and I think especially considering the sort of spirit of where we are as a country in our transition to one water, we should have kept things a lot more simple. Anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about results. But so this was administered online through Qualtrics. We had a super low response rate, which was really disappointing. There were 119 visits to the survey, but only 34 completed. And that included 13 pilot tests. So, you know, as you can imagine, we piloted with the people we interviewed. And so we felt like we were kind of, you know, doing this cyclical sort of testing that we weren't that happy about. So we were asking people questions about the framework that they basically helped to build. But still there was some stuff useful out of it. I'll talk a little bit about that now. Next slide. So again, you know, it provided a quantitative measure, which the survey, which the interviews don't do, of who we were talking to. So again, we were talking to mostly large scale utilities, right, that serve over 1 million. 51% of our respondents were from those types of agencies. Next. We were speaking to mostly, you know, upper level and middle management. And I think this is important because, you know, reflecting back, a lot of what we were hearing about was big picture elements, right? Not so much the metrics, but the big picture stuff. And this is the kind of stuff that these folks have on their mind, right? Perhaps if we talked to, you know, different staff, we would get a different idea about metrics. But I remember we found it very difficult to sort of like get to metrics when we were asking about them in our interviews. So anyway, it's just important to kind of reflect on who you're talking to and how that impacts the data you collect. Next. Again, I'm sorry about the small text, but basically this long bar here shows that, you know, over 40% of the respondents described their agency as being in this initial phase of just setting the foundation for a transition to one water. And so we sort of thought that this might be why we had such a low response rate as well, that, you know, it was just too complicated to ask folks that really aren't that familiar with this one water progression. Okay, next. So this is just how we define these different stages in case anyone was curious. You can go on to the next one. Okay, and so, you know, I would say we sort of abandoned a lot of our thinking of the survey, but I still think there's a lot of useful data, and I still look at it and try to pull from it. But, you know, maybe one of the things that I think is important is it shows the relative importance of these different key elements that we were asking about, which might be useful for prioritization, you know, in these resource constrained environments. So on this scale here, you know, 0 is not important at all, 5 is extremely important. And we asked them to sort of rate the relative importance of these different key elements. And so, you know, the ones that I've circled down here, I know again it's tiny, but institutional collaboration, water supply reliability, climate change resilience, organizational culture, and watershed and ecosystem health. These came out as sort of the top in terms of their participant response perception of importance in implementing a one water approach. Okay, next. The survey also provided opportunity for open-ended responses. And so after each key element, we asked about, feedback, like, did we miss anything? And we thought this was important to ultimately include into the framework to make sure we were capturing the full range of what people had on their minds. This response or this open-ended question was about barriers or obstacles. And so, the sort of things we often heard about in our early stakeholder interactions, like silos and lack of trust and people not wanting to give up power. We heard about those things again here. And again, there's a lot of data there that we still can comb through. Okay, next. And then so, Christy Wamstadt, who's like a rating system guru, she did her magic and she took all of this data and this is what she came up with. So this is the draft, of the rating system. So she kind of condensed with all of our input. I don't want to say she, like she didn't do it alone. The key elements into these actions processes. So one water planning, culture, stakeholder engagement, informed actions, and one water monitoring. And, came up with these 3 ideas for 3 different levels in the progression towards becoming a one water city. So level 1 would be onboarding, level 2 progressing, and level 3 advancing. And so, across each of these categories, there's a little description of what a city, for example, who's in the level 1 onboarding phase of one water planning would look like. Okay, and I know this is again hard to read, so I could pick one and read it out, but so if you're in level 1 onboarding of one water planning, you're in this information gathering stage, right? So you have a clear idea of the state of water in the community and related systems. You might have a library of core reports to identify data gaps, right? And studies that are needed to prepare the one water plan. Okay, it's sort of very broad intentionally and simple also intentionally, because we did hear a lot from during interviews that people didn't want something cumbersome and complex. Okay, next. Okay, so this is what this framework looks like in a more presentable, streamlined fashion. So again, you see the categories and these levels that they can go through, okay? And cities can be, across levels for these different categories. So you could be at a level 3 in terms of planning, but a level 1 in terms of organizational culture, right? And again, this is meant for self-assessment, not for us to sort of dictate where the cities are. Okay, next. Okay, so we're still working on these case studies for, Pepper, come here. Sorry, my dog just grabbed my purse. Case studies that sort of exemplify these different levels across the categories. I'm gonna grab her before I have a very bad day. Sorry. Okay, sorry. So we'll, again, we'll fill in, from each city a short example that exemplifies what this might look like for each of these categories. Okay, next. And so we're wrapping this up. So the next steps for this project specifically, we're going to have a workshop to review this framework in early June. We're still developing these case studies and still working on papers. These are the 2 that I have in mind, are the case study paper and then one really diving deeper into this one water mindset. Next. And then sort of zooming back out. So Mike and I have been talking about, how do we sort of wrap up and some things that might be cool to do. And so, just looking back over this sort of scope of all the work that's been done, conducting some sort of survey or interviews of our research team to assess, shifts in perception, influence of stakeholder engagement on thinking or on research might be interesting to do. Obviously, we want to think about how this framework that I was just discussing, how does this tie into the blueprint, and what does the dissemination of this product to our broader stakeholder network look like? It's always important to deliver something you say you're going to deliver, and so is this the product we should deliver? And then, thinking about all the work that's going on, how to characterize and sort of continue to grow and support this amazing network. Yeah. Next. And with that, we just want to thank you for your time. And I don't know if we have any time for questions. I think I talked too much, but.
No, we certainly have time for a few questions or comments or feedback. Thank you both very much. Appreciate your hard work there, and would welcome some of these discussions at our annual meeting at the end of June, which will be a little bit more intimate, I guess I'll say, smaller group of people this time. But yeah, definitely talking about next steps for UWIN, both within the research team and more broadly. I really appreciated your image too, Jess, at the beginning of your presentation about these different kind of spin-off projects, but they are really founded in the relationships that we either brought into UWIN or developed through UWIN and continue to nurture throughout the project. So that was a nice little snapshot. Any questions or comments for the team? Jeff, got something?
Yeah, thanks. No, great presentation, Mike and Jessica. So really nice to hear an update on all the activities and kind of a summary and synthesis of some of the stakeholder engagement throughout the project. So it's nice to have that all hear that all in one place in one presentation. So appreciate that. Question, I guess maybe for Jessica on maybe in case I missed it. On one of your slides, you had kind of a longer list of like 16 different topic areas, and then you talked about trying to identify maybe 3 to 5 metrics associated with each of those.
Yeah.
And then later there, kind of boils down to, this one. Does this information get boiled down into the thing that you present later, sort of those 3 different levels, if you will, or is this a separate thing?
It definitely does. And this was the topic of a lot of discussion for us, because I think, these are sort of like the terms that we're comfortable speaking in, and then all of a sudden there's different terms. But we kind of really put our trust in somebody has a lot of experience working with rating systems in condensing. And so you see a lot of these pop up in the deeper descriptions of each of those categories across the levels. But yeah, so it is really condensed, and it's a little tricky how you see these things show up there, but they are there.
Okay, no, that's great. Yeah, I mean, when I first saw this slide and I saw, I don't know, maybe a list of a dozen, I was thinking 5 to 7 indicators each. I was like, wow, that's going to be a lot, like 60 different things. And I know for some folks, especially if you're in that sort of level 1, if you're just learning, that it could be overwhelming to try to grapple with that. So I agree and applaud sort of the approach to kind of simplify that framework. It makes it much more digestible, I think, what you showed towards the end, and trying to incorporate all that into the more condensed framework, because it seems like it'll be more digestible for the end users. There was something somewhat related we did on a project focused on innovation, where they're trying to categorize the different types of innovators, if you will, and where you were on your progress in your, for utilities that were trying to develop an innovation program, trying to categorize where they were and their progress towards becoming a really innovative utility, and had some similarities in terms of the different levels and kind of the way you explained it. So it might be useful. Well, yeah, I could show you what they developed, but it's I think that type of thing I think is very helpful for utilities to be able to track where they are in a very understandable way. So I think
that would definitely be good to see before we go into this workshop.
Okay.
But I appreciate that feedback. That's definitely good to hear. I don't know, Sarah and Mike have been as intimately involved in this as I am. So, I don't know, Sarah, you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I can build a little bit. So the indicators piece is really hard, the indicators and metrics, because I think that's one of the things we've heard is lacking, is like, okay, we have this vision, but how do we really start to chug away and measure how well we're doing this? So the rating system and framework has some challenges where we're trying to keep it very simplistic and user friendly, but also making it meaningful, as well as providing the opportunity to use each other's knowledge bases and allow utilities to say to one another, oh, how are you measuring that? We're not trying to be very prescriptive of the individual metrics, but providing kind of a baseline context or catalog of indicators that all utilities should be measuring. And then as an organization progresses throughout the framework, those become either more granular or very specific to the challenges and drivers that the individual organizations are dealing with. So with our final report, there will be an entire chapter that talks about these indicators and metrics. And maybe someday further on down the road, there might be a web tool that's kind of like a wizard that walks an organization through the whole process. So stay tuned, but don't hold your breath.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. That's sort of the bigger picture thinking around that. And I think for, and if it does kind of move that direction, I think allowing, again, kind of tailoring it to the different levels, because, when you're first beginning, you could get overwhelmed trying to measure everything. So, maybe you kind of break it up into, if you had like a web tool or even a paper tool that was, you can maybe break it up into the different levels that someone's at and have a more some simpler metrics to start off with. And as people get more advanced in their progress towards one water approaches, that you can have more metrics and things that people they're able to, I think, handle more as they get more advanced.
Absolutely. And that's totally the thinking behind everything in level 1 will be readily available, already collected and measured information, where utilities are not going to be asked to do things that they're not already doing. So we're keeping it as simple as we can. And then it gets a little bit more complex as you move, further down in your progression.
So this is here. I have one question, maybe for both of you. So I think, Mike, I saw one of you talking about connecting stakeholders. So in one of your slides, you cite somebody, I think from private sector, sort of connecting. So I think that's pretty good example. On the Jessica slide, there you're talking about some of the barriers. So I think that my question really is, now we realize those kind of barriers, or some people sort of left us, I guess, so to speak. Do you have in this effort, do you have any recommendation how can we do better on the stakeholder engagement, or even or in order to make this sort of NSF level research more impactful, how can we do better? And then the related one really is that we still have this One Water City ongoing. Some of the interview survey, the citation from this utility people, that's pretty insightful. I think, I can see, if there's maybe a challenge, I think it's, if we have some sort of maybe action, can overcome a certain level barrier, can make this research more impactful. I didn't know how exactly. I just want to challenge you to see whether you already consider that. Maybe you can share with us. I think I didn't hear from this presentation yet. Maybe it's in your mind, I guess.
Well, I guess, you know, and we recognize this from the beginning. I mean, the more value we can provide to stakeholders, the better it is. But then we also recognize that there was this, as I called it in the presentation, a gulf, you know, between what was needed and what the researchers were doing in the beginning. So that kind of, you know, I had stakeholders in Miami ask me directly, like, are you really going to be able to kind of help us with our particular problem? And I felt like I had to say no, you know, because we can't really retool everything in short order to address their needs. So, but I think the way it evolved, you know, actually by kind of contracting a bit and that enabling more interaction with particular individual stakeholders really kind of was positive, because I think some of the future things that they did with Denver and New York and Philadelphia were really positive in that regard, right? They were able to really address specific needs quite directly in some of those cases. So it's been an interesting experience, I got to tell you. I mean, I didn't know how it would go, and I feel like I learned a lot, but I still don't have a great answer for you, other than trying to provide value and try to keep the intensity, perhaps, of the communication up, you know, when you can, if your project admits it, like if you have the money for it, fundamentally.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think that something that I found really helpful was, you know, actually when Sharon Harlan got that equity focused additional grant, right? And then, because I think the thing is, we're all still learning too, right? And I think we started to hear about how we had to include these equity considerations in everything we do. And so how we talk during these meetings can be very exclusive. And we discuss this kind of stuff a lot in our teams because we don't want to be exclusive. And, you know, I think oftentimes we get to these situations where we become really comfortable speaking to a certain background of stakeholder. And, you know, oftentimes these stakeholders have similar training to some of us. And, you know, we want to kind of avoid that to really engage in truly participatory research. And so, or if that is in fact what we want to do, right? So I think, you know, again, it's really important from the outset of the project to be really clear with exactly who you want to involve and why, and to really think about, you know, the outcomes of the research, and if they really do address, you know, whose needs they really do and can address, and be really sort of, you know, intentional about the way that the language we're using and the way that we're structuring these meetings. Because it's true, you know, we have to think about these things a little bit more and not just get into this pattern of the way that we perform our engagement strategies.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we are at the end of our timeline for today. So if there's not any other outstanding questions or feedback, I don't see anything in the chat. One quick announcement for those of you still hanging on. We unfortunately have to move our Wednesday URP presentation to another date. We had some last minute scheduling snafus come up. So we hope to see you guys all back next Monday, which is May 16th. And I'll be in touch with an updated invite for that URP presentation. But thanks, Mike and Jessica. Always lovely to see your faces, and same to Harry and Jeff. Appreciate your time today. Have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the sunshine if it's sunny in your neck of the woods.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.